So that gives us a bit of context as to the ethos of what Stoicism is about. Now let's look at a very basic timeline, just to give us an overview of the three main stages of how the philosophy progressed. So with its conception in 301 BC, this is the founding era of Stoicism. This takes us to 230 BC and the teachings of Chrysippus, who was instrumental in developing Stoicism into a legitimate philosophy. The 1st and 2nd century BC, you've got the Middle Stoa period, generally refers to the exporting of the philosophy from Greece to Rome. And in the 1st and 2nd century AD, you have the real burgeoning of Stoicism as it spread to the Roman Empire. So the philosophy of Stoicism began in Athens around 301 BC, and it was founded by a Phoenician merchant called Zeno, who hailed from Citium, which is in Cyprus. And he's not to be confused with Zeno of Elea, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher and famous for his paradoxes. Around this time, Stoicism was just one of several competing schools inspired by the life of Socrates, who had been executed a century earlier. And the derivation of the term Stoicism stems from the fact that Zeno and his followers would meet in the Stoa Poikile, meaning painted porch, which was a famous colonnade situated in the north side of the agora. It's said that during his lectures, Zeno would vigorously pace up and down, which had the effect of keeping the porch clear of people slouching. And there's a long-held idea that stretches back to its foundation that Stoicism was viewed as the philosophy of the people on the street, or a philosophy for ordinary people, and not for those confined to the lofty ivory towers of academia. There does seem to be remnants of their predecessors' philosophies that were incorporated into the Stoic school of thought. For example, the Stoics used laconic adages or sayings, which were very succinct and contained self-evident truths. And this seemed to hark back to the Spartans of Laconia, which is where we get the term laconic from, meaning language that is unambiguous, short, and to the point, as this is how the Spartans of Laconia were renowned to converse with one another. Now, furthermore, the Stoics often cite their philosophical forefathers whom they revered, and Plato, for instance, would have been largely regarded not just by the Stoics, but practically all Hellenistic schools that followed thereafter as a kind of sacrosanct figure. Even if the Stoics did not align themselves with all aspects of Platonism, they certainly would have despised the sophists in the same way as Plato and his mentor Socrates famously did. Now, Zeno's ideas developed from those of the Cynics, whose founding father was Antisthenes, and he had been a disciple of Socrates as well. Zeno's most influential follower, however, was Chrysippus. And it was Chrysippus who was responsible for molding what is now known as Stoicism. He was instrumental in distinguishing Stoicism by its stark pragmatism. Its precepts are all geared towards addressing the problems of the human condition and acknowledging what we can and what we can't change. I think it's worth providing just a little bit more detail on Chrysippus here, as he was regarded as one of the preeminent intellectuals of the ancient world, and his contributions to Stoicism can't be overlooked. He wrote hundreds of volumes detailing philosophical arguments in defense of the Stoic doctrine, and particularly to address criticisms that came from the rival school of thought, the skeptics. The main point to remember here is Chrysippus took quite an obscure and relatively unknown philosophy, which Zeno had conceptualized, and he made it mainstream. So to go back to the timeline briefly, I want to provide a little bit more detail with regard to exactly who the prominent figures were of the early, middle, and late Stoic periods. So, like I just covered, in 301 BC, you've got the founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Citium. He began teaching in the colonnade in the agora of Athens, and this was known as the Stoa Poikile. And they took their name from that location, and they became known as the Stoics. 230 BC, following Cleanthes, Chrysippus becomes the third head of the Stoic school and shapes much of what is now known as Stoicism today. In the first to second century BC, the most notable Stoics from the Middle Stoa period see Stoicism make its way to Rome. And the two most prominent figures here with exporting the philosophy are Panaetius and Posidonius. They both adopt a more eclectic view of the Stoic philosophy. But then in the first to second century AD, you could consider this as the golden age of Stoicism, the blossoming. And the late Stoa period, we have today's best-known Stoics that produce complete works that have survived through the ages. And this includes Seneca the Younger, Musonius Rufus, Epictetus, and of course, Marcus Aurelius, the Roman general.